blood was already on his hands when Celeste Winterbourne walked through the door. Tavian Von Carstein stood in the center of the clinic's back room, silver-white hair loose around his shoulders, pale as carved marble, his dark coat soaked through at the sleeve where an iron bolt had punched clean through the muscle. He had not made a sound when it happened. He had not made a sound in roughly 340 years. Give or take a decade, he preferred not to count. Silence was armor. Stillness was dominance. Pain was simply information, and information was manageable. What was not manageable, it turned out, was the woman who shoved through the door of the Knightbridge Community Clinic at 2 a.m, with a medical kit under one arm and fury written across every line of her face. "Sit down," she said, not asking. He looked at her the way glaciers look at things, slow, absolute. "Unmoved, I do not," Tavian said, his voice carrying the weight of old courts and older blood. "Take instructions from humans." Celeste Winterbourne set her kit on the steel table, snapped on a pair of gloves, and crossed her arms. She was 28 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of calm that came not from inexperience, but from having already seen the worst the world could produce and deciding to fight it anyway. She had stitched knife wounds in alley backrooms. She had talked men off ledges at 4 a.m. She had sat with the dying and refused to let them be afraid. She looked at the iron bolt punched through the forearm of an ancient vampire lord and said, "Then bleed out on my floor, your choice." Something shifted behind his silver eyes. Not respect, not yet, but something adjacent to it, a flicker. He sat. That was the moment, though neither of them knew it yet. That was the thread being pulled, the first careful unraveling of 340 years of deliberate numbness, and it would undo him completely before all was said and done. 3 weeks earlier, the world had not yet broken open. The Knightbridge Clinic sat on the eastern edge of the city, wedged between a laundromat and a building that had once been a church and was now optimistically described as a community center. Celeste ran it with 2 rotating volunteers, a nurse named Dora who came in on Tuesdays, and a budget that required her to perform minor miracles on a weekly basis just to keep the lights on. She treated the people other clinics turned away, uninsured workers, people afraid of hospitals, people the system had decided were not worth the paperwork. She had opened it herself 4 years ago, with inherited savings and a degree in emergency medicine and the kind of stubborn idealism that her colleagues at the hospital had called naive and she had called necessary. She did not know, when she opened the clinic, that Knightbridge sat on the boundary of something much older than zoning laws. The vampire courts of the Western continent had maintained their hold on 3 major cities for 2 centuries, operating beneath the human world with the practiced invisibility of things that have survived long enough to understand patience. They had businesses. They had networks. They had blood-sworn territories divided along lines that did not appear on any human map, and they had guards, ancient and deadly, who enforced the boundaries of those territories with the quiet efficiency of men who had been killing for longer than most countries had existed. Tavian Von Carstein was the oldest of those guards, the most feared, the most deliberately, architecturally cold. He had not always been cold. There had been a time, centuries ago, before the blood law that had broken him, before the betrayal that had taught him what feeling cost, when he had been something closer to a man. He did not think about that time. He had built walls around that time, the way ancient civilizations built walls around their cities, thick and high, and meant to last. He had been assigned to oversee the Knightbridge boundary 3 months ago, when the Eastern Court's previous enforcer had been killed in a territorial dispute that the council was calling an accident, and everyone with eyes was calling an assassination. The eastern boundary was unstable. Rogue vampires, unaligned and dangerous, had begun moving through it, drawn by the city's density and the relative weakness of the disrupted court structure. Tavian did not particularly want to be in Knightbridge. He did not want anything by design, but he went where the council sent him because that was the shape his existence had taken, and shapes, once hardened, were difficult to alter. He had noticed the clinic immediately. It was an anomaly, a human woman operating alone in the eastern boundary district at all hours, treating anyone who came through her door without question. He had watched it for 2 weeks before concluding that she was either reckless or remarkable, or some combination of the two. Then Dravek's people had put an iron bolt through his arm during a boundary confrontation, and the nearest place with medical supplies had been the clinic, and Celeste Winterbourne had told him to sit down, and he had. She worked quickly and without flinching. The iron complicated things, interfering with the body's supernatural healing, and the wound was deeper than it appeared. She cleaned it, assessed the damage with precise and competent hands, and began to close it with the kind of focused efficiency that spoke of real training and real experience. "You are not afraid," he said, watching her work. "I'm a little afraid," she said without looking up. "I've just learned that afraid and capable aren't mutually exclusive." He considered that. It was not the kind of answer he received often. Most humans, when faced with what he was, either panicked or performed a rigid kind of bravery that was really just panic wearing a different mask. She was neither panicking nor performing. "You know what I am," he said. "I've been running a clinic in this neighborhood for 4 years," she said. "You're not the first vampire who's come through that door. You're the first who's bled quite this dramatically, but you're not the first." She looked up then, briefly, her dark eyes meeting his silver ones with a directness that was genuinely unusual. "I don't care what you are. I care that you're injured." He was quiet for a long moment, watching her work. "Why?" he said finally. She glanced up again. "Why what? Why do you care? You have no obligation, no blood law binds you to this. No court demands it. Why do you put yourself in the path of things that could destroy you?" Celeste tied off the last suture, sat back, and looked at him properly for the first time. He was, she acknowledged privately, the most striking thing she had ever seen. Not handsome in any ordinary way, but extraordinary in the manner of things that existed outside ordinary categories. White hair like winter light, skin that held the pale luminosity of old alabaster, eyes that were the color of polished mercury, and carried in them a depth that suggested time on a scale she could not entirely comprehend. "Because someone has to," she said, "and I'm the one who's here." He left without saying thank you. He came back 4 days later. He told himself it was a professional assessment. The clinic sat on the boundary. He was monitoring the boundary. It was logical, efficient, entirely without sentiment. He stood outside for 40 minutes before he went in. She was treating a child with a badly sprained wrist when he arrived, talking in a low, warm voice that kept the child calm while she worked. He watched through the open door of the treatment room. She was explaining what she was doing as she did it, her voice steady and gentle, her hands impossibly careful. The child stopped crying, trusted her completely within minutes. When the child and her mother had gone, Celeste found him in the waiting area and raised an eyebrow. "I'm giving you trouble," she said. "It healed," he said. "Faster than it would have without your intervention," she nodded. "Iron impedes the process. You know vampire physiology. I've read everything I could find, which isn't much. Your court doesn't exactly publish medical journals." She tilted her head. "Why are you here?" He did not have an answer that he was willing to examine honestly. "The Boundary District is under my oversight," he said instead. "This clinic is within the boundary." She looked at him for a moment with those dark, perceptive eyes. Then she said, "There's coffee if you want it. I'm going to assume you don't actually drink it, but the offer stands." He stayed for 2 hours. He told himself that was also professional. He was gathering information about the boundary. She was an observant human with 4 years of experience in this specific district. She had information that was relevant to his work. They talked about the neighborhood, about the people who came through her door, about the things she had seen that she categorized not as supernatural, exactly, but as beyond the ordinary explanations. She was careful and precise in how she spoke about these things, measuring her words with a kind of intellectual honesty he found himself, against all design, admiring. She did not ask him personal questions. She did not press. She simply spoke to him as though he were a person, which was, he realized, with something that moved uncomfortably in his chest, not something he experienced frequently. Courts were about hierarchy and power and the management of appearances. Councils were about strategy. Even his brother guards treated him with a deference that was its own kind of distance. Celeste Winterbourne spoke to him the way she had spoken to that child, with direct, uncomplicated attention. He came back the following week, and the week after that, the third time he came, there was a man in the waiting room who Tavian identified immediately as a rogue, unaligned, young, by vampire standards, perhaps 60 years turned and radiating the unstable energy of someone who had not yet learned to govern the hunger. He was watching Celeste through the glass of the treatment room door with an expression that made something ancient and absolutely decisive move through Tavian's body. He crossed the waiting room in 4 steps and put himself between the rogue and the treatment room door. "Leave," he said. The rogue looked up at him, paled further, which was an impressive feat, felt the weight of 3 centuries pressing through the air between them like a physical force. He left without a word. Celeste came out of the treatment room 20 minutes later to find Tavian standing exactly where he had positioned himself, arms crossed, back to the door, eyes on the entrance. "You're still here," she said. "There was a rogue in your waiting room." She was quiet for a moment. "Is he gone?" "Yes." "Did you hurt him?" "No, he was sensible enough not to require it." She let out a slow breath. "Thank you. I did not do it for gratitude." "I know," she said, and something in her voice was very quiet and very careful. "I know you didn't. Something about that understanding, that simple and unembarrassed acknowledgement of what he was and what he had done and why, cracked something in the wall he had built. Not much, a hairline fracture, but he felt it, which meant he was already in trouble, and he understood that and chose to stay anyway, which told him something about himself he had spent 3 centuries trying not to know. The 4th week, she asked about the blood law. She asked carefully, not intrusively, in the context of something she had read. She was trying to understand the medical implications of a court-enforced feeding restriction on younger vampires, because 2 of them had come to her in the past month showing signs of severe deprivation. And she wanted to understand why the court would mandate something that caused that kind of harm. He told her about the blood law, The way you tell someone about an old wound briefly, from a distance. The blood law of the Western courts was ancient, predating 3 generations of current council members. It established strict protocols around feeding, territory, and the treatment of human populations within court boundaries. It was, in its original intention, a protective measure. In practice, like most laws that had outlasted their context, it had become a tool. The court used the restrictions to maintain control over younger, less established vampires, dangling relief from the law's most stringent aspects as reward for loyalty. "That's coercive," Celeste said flatly. "That's politics," he said. "Those aren't different things." He found himself, for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, wanting to smile. He did not. But he wanted to, and the wanting itself was extraordinary. Then Dravik's second assassination attempt complicated everything. Dravik Morthis was the rogue who had been moving through the eastern boundary for the past 2 months. He was old enough to be genuinely dangerous, young enough by court standards to be reckless, and he was building a network of unaligned vampires that the council had been watching with increasing concern. The iron bolt through Tavian's arm had been his opening statement. The message had been clear. The eastern boundary was being contested. The second message was clearer. Tavian arrived at the clinic on a Tuesday evening to find the front door hanging open, and 3 of Dravik's people inside. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not something Celeste described afterward. She had been in the back storage room when they came in, and she had stayed there, which had saved her life. Tavian moved through the clinic with the absolute terrible efficiency of something that had been built over centuries for exactly this kind of moment. Not brutal. Precise. The 3 were subdued. Not killed, which was a specific and deliberate choice, because killing them would have escalated the territorial dispute in ways the council would not appreciate. And more importantly, Celeste was in the building, and he did not want violence of that scale near her. When it was over, he stood in the center of the clinic and called out, very calmly, "They are contained." "You can come out." She came out slowly. She took in the scene, 3 vampires secured by means she could not entirely explain, unconscious or close enough to it, as made no difference. Tavian standing in the middle of it all, not a scratch on him, silver eyes moving to her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not quite relief. It was something older than relief. Something that had not had reason to be expressed in a very long time and did not entirely know how to wear its shape. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. "Are you?" The question seemed to stop him. Not because the answer was complicated, because no one had asked, not in longer than he could rally amount for. No one had asked if he was hurt. "No," he said. She nodded. Then she sat down on one of the waiting room chairs because her knees were not entirely steady, and she breathed carefully for a moment, and he crossed the room and sat beside her without being invited because there was something happening in him that he could not manage from a distance anymore. "I need to move the clinic," she said quietly. "No," he said immediately. She looked at him. Tavian. It was the first time she had used his name without the formal title. He was aware of it the way he was aware of changes in pressure before a storm. "I will deal with Dravik," he said. "That's not the point. The point is that this place is attracting attention because of you, because you keep coming here." She was not saying it unkindly. She was being precise. It was one of the things about her that was so consistently, disruptively real. If you stop coming, it becomes less of a target. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she was learning to read. This complex layering of responses that had been suppressed so thoroughly that each one surfaced like something emerging from very deep water. "I am aware," he said, "that the logical solution to your safety is my absence. Yes, I am also aware," he continued, "that I am not going to do that." The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, charged. "Why?" she said very quietly. He looked at her, and for one moment the wall was entirely transparent, and she could see straight through it 340 years of deliberate, constructed emptiness, and beneath it something that had been waiting, patient and enduring, for exactly this. "Because," he said, "I am not capable of it anymore." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost something else. Then she leaned her head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and said, "This is going to be very complicated." "It already is," he said. "Tell me about the betrayal," she said the following week, and the words landed so precisely that he was sure she had been carrying them for some time, waiting for the right moment. He had told her nothing about his history. She had pieced it together from fragments, from the way he flinched almost imperceptibly at certain court references, from the shape of what he did not say. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would decline, and she was already preparing to let it go, to respect the wall. Then he told her. 340 years ago, he had not been a guard. He had been a court lord in his own right, with territory and standing, and something that he had believed, in the confidence of youth and power, was love. Her name had been Vesrin, and she had been vampire-born, beautiful and clever, and apparently deeply invested in a court alliance that Tavian had been positioned to disrupt. She had spent 2 years building something with him that had felt like the solid ground of a new world, and then she had handed his territorial secrets to the opposition council and watched with the particular coolness of someone who had never felt what she had performed. While his court was dismantled around him, he had survived. Of course he had. He was 3 centuries old by then, and not easily destroyed. But something that had been alive in him, something that had believed in the possibility of being known and chosen, had not survived. He had built the wall out of what remained of that brick by methodical brick, and he had gone to work for the council as a guard, because guards were expected to feel nothing, and he was, at last, very good at that. Celeste listened to all of it. She did not try to minimize it, or reframe it, or make it smaller than it was. When he finished, she said, 340 years is a very long time to be in pain. "I am not in pain," he said automatically. She looked at him. He looked at her. "The absence of feeling," she said carefully, "is its own kind of pain." He did not respond. But his jaw moved slightly, a muscle working, and she understood that she had reached something true. She reached across the space between them and put her hand over his, just that. Her warm human hand over his cool, still one. He looked down at it. Then he turned his hand over slowly, carefully, like something learning a new movement, and held hers. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Meanwhile, Dravik's network was metastasizing in ways that alarmed the Eastern Court Council. He had stopped being merely a territorial irritant and had become a genuine threat, recruiting disaffected vampires from 3 different courts and building something that looked, to eyes with enough experience, like the preliminary architecture of a coup. The council summoned Tavian to a formal session, which meant the underground chamber beneath the Knightbridge district's oldest building, a converted Victorian warehouse that the humans above thought housed an architecture firm. The chamber was exactly what it sounded like. The council sat in a curving row of high-backed chairs that were older than the city. There were 12 of them, white-haired and ancient, and beautiful in the way that long-survived things became beautiful. And they regarded Tavian with the collective weight of centuries when he stood before them. The council's concern was not, precisely, Dravik. Their concern was the exposure risk. 3 of Dravik's incursions into the eastern boundary had been in or adjacent to a human-operated medical clinic. The council was aware of Celeste Winterbourne. They were aware of Tavian's repeated presence in her clinic. Lord Aldrich, the council's eldest and therefore most authoritative voice, spoke with the precision of someone who had been making consequential pronouncements for 600 years. The human woman represents an unacceptable exposure risk, he said. She has knowledge of our nature, our presence, and our territorial boundaries. The blood law is clear on the management of human witnesses who acquire this level of information. Tavian stood very still. The blood law in this particular application was explicit. Humans who became aware of court operations to a significant degree had 3 sanctioned outcomes: integration into court service, memory modification, or removal. "She is under my protection," Tavian said. The chamber was very quiet. "You have no authority," Aldrich said, "to extend personal protection that contradicts blood law directives." "I am the boundary overseer of the Eastern District," Tavian said. "Within that territory, protection decisions fall under my jurisdiction," Aldrich said. "Does not extend to violations of blood law." "I would dispute," Tavian said with the absolute, unaffected calm of something that had been in enough rooms like this to know exactly what power looked like and how to wear it, that the blood law was intended to apply to a civilian healer operating a medical facility who has caused no harm to the court and in fact provided assistance to injured court members. He paused to let that land. "I would further note," he continued, "that the last 3 disruptions to the eastern boundary originated with Dravik Morthis, not with Celeste Winterbourne, and that the most effective resolution to the council's concern about exposure would be addressing the actual source of the disruption." Aldrich regarded him for a long moment. "You are personally invested," he said. "It was not a question, precisely. It was an observation, and it carried in it a warning." "I am invested," Tavian said, "in the stability of the eastern boundary, which is my assignment." He left the chamber with the council's agreement to delay any decision regarding Celeste until after Dravik had been dealt with. It was not a victory. It was a temporary stay, and he knew it, and the knowledge of what it meant, the clarity about what he was now fighting for and why, was the last piece of the wall coming down. He went directly to the clinic. She was there, which she almost always was at 11 at night, filing paperwork at the front desk with the dogged efficiency of someone who had accepted that administrative work was simply part of keeping people alive. She looked up when he came in. She took one look at his face and said, "What happened?" He told her all of it. The council session, the blood law provision, the stay he had negotiated, and how long it was likely to hold. She was quiet throughout. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment longer, and then she said, "They could modify my memory. Yes, it is within their capability. It is one of the 3 sanctioned outcomes. What are the other 2? Court service or removal." She understood what removal meant. "And you buying time by dealing with Dravik keeps any of those off the table for now." "Yes." She stood up from the desk and came around it, and she stood in front of him, close enough that the warmth of her was a physical fact, and she looked up at him with those dark, perceptive eyes that had never, in all the weeks since he had walked bleeding through her door, looked away from the truth of what he was. "Then we deal with Dravik," she said. He looked at her. "The we hit him somewhere entirely undefended. You are a healer," he said, "not a fighter. I know. But I'm also very good at logistics. I have 4 years of detailed knowledge about this boundary district, and you are apparently very bad at accepting help." She tilted her chin up slightly. "You told a 300-person vampire council that this clinic was under your protection. The least I can do is make sure it's worth protecting." For the second time in his very long life, Tavian Von Carstein wanted to smile. This time he did. It was not a large smile. It was barely perceptible, a slight movement at the corner of his mouth, the smallest and yet most seismic expression. But it happened, and Celeste saw it, and the look on her face when she saw it, the quiet, luminous recognition of having reached something true, was something he knew he would carry for the rest, whatever remained of his centuries. Celeste's contribution to the intelligence about Dravik's network was, in the event, substantial. 4 years of operating a clinic in the Eastern Boundary District meant she had spoken to nearly everyone in those streets. She knew which buildings had been recently occupied and which had not. She had noticed, without necessarily understanding, the patterns of movement that were now clearly consistent with Dravik's recruitment operations. She had treated 2 of his people without knowing who they were, because they had come to her injured, and she did not ask people to declare their affiliations at the door. She drew Tavian a map, a real one, annotated with dates and times and the specific nature of each observation. It was the most precise intelligence document he had seen in the entire 3 months of the Dravik situation, and it had been compiled by a human healer in her spare time out of a combination of clinical observation and the habit, deep and genuine, of paying attention to the people around her. He looked at the map for a long time, then he looked at her. "How did you see all of this?" he said. "Because I listen," she said simply. "People talk when they trust you, and people trust you when you show up for them, every time, no matter what." She was not speaking abstractly, he realized. She was speaking about something she had built, deliberately and carefully, over years. A kind of trust that was the opposite of what had been done to him. Not performed and strategic, but real. He thought about Vezrin. He thought about the 2 years he had spent believing in something that had been a court maneuver. He thought about the wall. Then he looked at Celeste Winterbourne, who had told him to sit down and stitched him back together, and spoken to him like a person, and held his hand in the dark of a quiet clinic. And he thought, this is the opposite of that. The operation to intercept Dravik came together over 4 days. Tavian worked with 2 trusted members of the Eastern Court Guard, both old enough to be discreet and loyal enough not to report back to Aldrich until the matter was resolved. The goal was not a confrontation, but a disruption. Dismantle the network, remove the leadership, and resolve the territorial dispute in a way that gave the Council nothing further to leverage. Celeste was not present for the operation itself. This was non-negotiable, and she accepted it not because she was told to, but because she was genuinely intelligent and understood the difference between her contributions and someone else's. "I'll be at the clinic," she said. "If anyone needs patching up afterward, I'll be here. If anyone needs patching up afterward," Tavian said. "I am going to be deeply disappointed in our planning." She laughed, genuinely, warmly, with no performance in it. He felt it move through him like something warm in a space that had been cold for 3 centuries. The operation ran in the early morning hours of a Thursday. Dravek's primary base of operations turned out to be a converted underground parking structure beneath an office building 3 blocks from the eastern boundary line, which explained several of the gaps in the court's previous surveillance. Underground structures fell between the patrol boundaries. What followed was not something Tavian described to Celeste in detail, because it was not something she needed to carry, and because his care for her now extended to what he asked her to hold. The short version was that Dravek was considerably more established than the council had assessed. The confrontation was more significant than planned, and by the end of it, Dravek Morthis was in council custody, his network was dismantled, and the eastern boundary was, for the first time in 4 months, stable. What Tavian did not include in his report to the council was the moment near the end of the confrontation, when Dravek had said, with the particular cruelty of someone who had done their research, "The human woman, she means something to you." And Tavian had said nothing because silence had always been his armor, and Dravek had smiled with all of his teeth and said, "The council will find that interesting," which meant that Dravek intended to use it, even in custody, as leverage, which meant the council would hear it, which meant the stay Tavian had negotiated was going to collapse. He went to Celeste before he went back to the council. She was at the clinic, as she had said she would be, and she had apparently spent the intervening hours reorganizing the supply storage because she had a great deal of difficulty with unstructured waiting and preferred to do something useful instead of sitting still. She looked up when he came in, took in his expression, and said, "Tell me." He told her. She did not panic. She sat down on the examination table and was very still for a moment, thinking, with the kind of concentrated, precise focus he had come to recognize as what she looked like when she was working a real problem. The 3 outcomes are court service, memory modification, or removal, she said. Yes, memory modification would mean I couldn't do this work anymore, not here, not without context. It would affect only recent memory, technically, but the practical result is significant disruption and court service. He was quiet. What does court service actually mean for a human? She asked. It varies. Some humans in court service operate largely in their existing roles, but under court oversight and within court protections. Healers have historically been valuable to courts. She raised her eyes to his. Would I be protected under court law in that case? Yes. Court service carries blood law protections. You would be considered court-bound, which changes the legal classification significantly. And who oversees the court service assignment? He met her eyes. In the Eastern District, that falls under the boundary overseer. That would be you, she said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. Tavian, are you asking me to voluntarily enter court service as a solution to the blood law problem? I am, he said, presenting it as an available option. I am not asking you to do anything. I will not ask you to do anything that constrains your freedom or your work or your choices. I would rather. And here something moved in his voice that was real and unguarded, in a way he had not allowed in centuries. Fight the entire council, then put you in a position you did not choose. She was very quiet for a moment. If I enter court service voluntarily, she said slowly, I keep my memory, I keep the clinic, and the blood law provision no longer applies to me, correct? And I'd be under your protection officially rather than just informally. Yes, she looked at him for a long time. What she saw there, in his silver eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the 340 years of careful emptiness that was now entirely, helplessly transparent to her, was a man who was terrified. Not of the council, not of Dravek, not of any physical or political danger. Terrified of her answer, terrified of wanting something enough that its absence would mean something. "Yes," she said. His breath moved. He had not breathed, not truly in a very long time, but something released in him in a way that was the emotional equivalent of breathing. "You are certain," he said. "I'm choosing this," she said. "That's different from being certain about everything it means. But yes, I'm choosing this." He crossed the room in 2 steps and stood in front of her, very close, the warmth of her reaching him across the small distance. He raised one hand, and with a careful and extraordinary delicateness for something with so much power in it, touched her face. She turned into it slightly, instinctively, naturally. "Celeste," he said, and her name in his voice, in that voice that had been a weapon and a wall for 300 years, was something else entirely. Something that had finally remembered what it was for. She put her hand over his, the way she had weeks ago in the dark of the clinic. Only this time she turned her face into his palm and closed her eyes. "I know," she said quietly. "I know. I do not have practice with this," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I have spent a very long time building something designed to prevent exactly this from happening. No," she said again. "I watched you do it. Every time you came in here and told yourself it was professional, and then stayed 2 hours longer than necessary." His expression moved in a way that was almost helpless, almost human. "I noticed that too," he admitted. She opened her eyes and looked at him and said, "We'll figure it out. That's what people do." Then, because she was Celeste Winterbourne and she did not deal in approximations when the real thing was available, she said, "I'm not afraid of who you are. I've never been afraid of who you are. I'm a little afraid of how much I already care about what happens to you. But I've decided that afraid and capable aren't mutually exclusive." She smiled slightly when she said it, echoing her own words from the very first night, and he recognized them, and something in his face opened entirely, every constructed, defended layer falling away at once, and he was simply present with her in a way he had not been present in the world in 340 years. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to decide otherwise, and when she reached up to meet him, he kissed her with all the care of something that understood, with the full weight of its enormous history, exactly how rare this was. The council session 2 days later was, by every external metric, a formal proceeding. Tavian stood before the 12 with a formal court document, filed according to blood law protocol, establishing Celeste Winterbourne as a human court-bound under Eastern boundary protection and his direct oversight. The document was precise and correct in every legal detail, and left no opening for challenge. Aldrich examined it for a long time. "This is unusual," he said. "It is permitted," Tavian said. "You are personally invested?" Aldrich said again, the same observation as before, with the same warning in it. "I am," Tavian said. This time he did not qualify it or redirect it. He said it cleanly and with complete steadiness, and the 12 felt the weight of what that meant from a vampire who had spent 3 centuries being explicitly and architecturally nothing of the sort. Aldrich sat back. "Dravek's claim regarding your attachment to this human is accurate," Tavian said. "I do not dispute it." The chamber was very quiet. "The blood law," Aldrich said slowly, "was designed to protect the courts from exposure risk through human witnesses. A human who is court-bound and court-protected is, by definition, not an exposure risk. She is court-adjacent." He paused. The provision does not apply. No, Tavian said. It does not. Another long pause. Lord Valdris, who was second eldest and had always been more politically precise than ideologically rigid, said, "The eastern boundary has been stabilized. The Dravek network has been dismantled. The boundary overseer has managed the situation within Bloodlaw protocols." He looked down the row at Aldrich. "I see nothing to object to." The vote, when it came, was 8-4, in favor of accepting the court-bound filing. Aldrich was among the 4 who declined, but the count was sufficient, and the decision was recorded in the court register. Tavian left the chamber and walked to the clinic. She was treating someone. He waited in the hallway, which had become, without any formal declaration, simply where he waited when she was working. After 20 minutes, the patient left and she came out and found him there, and the look on his face told her before he said anything. "It's done," she said. "It is done." She leaned against the doorframe and let out a long breath. Then she looked at him with something warm and fierce and entirely undisguised. "Thank you," she said, "for fighting for this, for fighting for me." "It was not a sacrifice," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I have spent 300 years pretending sacrifice was the only reason for anything I did. This was not sacrifice. This was choice." He met her eyes. "You taught me the difference." She crossed the distance between them and put her arms around him, and he held her with a certainty and a care that 340 years had finally, somehow, been worth arriving at. In the months that followed, the textures of Tavian's existence changed in ways that were both enormous and, from the outside, subtle. He still ran the eastern boundary. He still attended council sessions, still enforced the codes and protocols that centuries of court structure required. He was no less precise, no less commanding, no less the thing that unaligned vampires looked at and then looked away from quickly. But he came to the clinic, every week, sometimes more. He sat with Celeste while she worked, not interfering, simply present. He learned her rhythms, the way he had learned the rhythms of courts and territories, with careful, sustained attention. He learned what made her laugh and what made her quiet, and what she looked like at 3 a.m, when she was very tired but unwilling to stop, and he learned to bring her coffee not because he could drink it, but because she needed it, and he had noticed. She, in turn, learned him. The pieces that had been buried so long they had almost calcified. She drew out with the same patient precision she applied to everything. She learned what he looked like when something amused him, and he was working hard not to show it. She learned the particular quality of his silence when something had moved him. She learned that he had opinions about architecture and that he found most of the Eastern Court's older members deeply exhausting, and that he had spent 300 years being lonely without ever allowing himself to name it as such. She named it for him gently. One night, when they were sitting on the roof of the clinic because the summer air was warm and the city was lit up around them, and he had said something about the strange quality of watching cities change over centuries, the way buildings fell and rose, and the humans moved through them like a river that kept flowing no matter what. "That sounds very lonely," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes, I think it was." "Is," she corrected carefully, "not was. Past tense gives people permission to stop sitting with it." He looked at her. "Is," he said, "sometimes less than it was." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Above them, the city hummed with its 10,000 ordinary lives. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone," she said. He thought about it. The wall was down, but the habit of silence ran deep, and choosing to speak was still always an act. When I was a court lord, he said slowly, before Vezrin, before all of it, I used to collect maps, not for strategic reasons. I found them beautiful, the way humans tried to make sense of their world by drawing its edges. I had hundreds of them. He paused. I have not looked at a map for pleasure in 300 years. She sat up and looked at him. Her eyes were very bright. I'm going to buy you a map, she said. He looked at her. A beautiful one. Something old. There's a shop on Calloway Street that sells antique prints. I've walked by it 100 times. She was smiling now, warm and real and entirely genuine. You can have it in the clinic. So there's something of yours here. Something moved in his chest that he now recognized, having had some weeks of practice with it, as the sensation of being known, being seen, not managed or performed for or used, but simply, honestly known. Celeste, he said. Yes. He turned toward her on the rooftop and took her face in his hands with that extraordinary careful precision that was his and no one else's, and he said, very quietly, I love you. The words came out with the weight of everything they had cost. 3 centuries of building walls, one human woman who had refused every wall he put between them, and a feeling that had been growing since the night she told him to sit down and meant it. She looked at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not entirely composed. And she said, I love you too. I've been waiting for you to say it first, because I thought you needed to. He let out a slow breath. Was I that transparent only to me? She said. You're very intimidating to everyone else. Good. And she laughed, and he kissed her, there on the roof of the clinic with the city spread around them, and he thought that 340 years was a very long time, and that this was worth every year of it. The map she bought him was extraordinary. She found it at the Calloway Street shop on a Saturday morning, a cartographic print from the 1700s showing the eastern coastline with all the beautiful inaccuracies of an era that was still working out the details of the world's edges. She had it framed and brought it to the clinic and hung it on the wall of the back room where he always sat. He stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. Do you like it? She asked. It is the most valuable thing in this clinic, he said. And then, because she knew him now, including me, she laughed so hard she had to sit down. He looked at the map and felt something settle in him, deep and permanent, the kind of settling that does not come from things being resolved, but from things being accepted, from standing inside your own life without armor and finding that you can. The eastern boundary is stabilized through the autumn. The council, with Dravik's network dismantled and the territorial lines held firm, turned its attention to other matters. Aldrich remained a complicating presence in council proceedings, as Aldrich had been a complicating presence in council proceedings for 600 years and showed no signs of changing his nature, but the specific threats to Celeste and the clinic receded. New challenges arose, as they always did, a second territorial dispute on the northern edge of the district, a court refinement of the blood law that required Tavian to spend a miserable week in council sessions arguing against provisions that were both legally dubious and practically harmful. 3 separate occasions when rogue vampires, unaware of the clinic's protected status, approached it with intentions that Tavian resolved with the quiet, absolute efficiency of something that had been built for exactly that. Each time he came back, each time she was there, and Tavian Von Carstein, who had spent 340 years constructing an existence proof that feeling nothing was the only safe way to live, found himself discovering with some regularity that he had been wrong, not recklessly wrong, not in a way that made him careless or naive. He was still precise, still commanding, still the thing that rooms went quiet for. But beneath the precision and the authority and the 3 centuries of accumulated power, something breathed again. Something moved. Something that had been waiting for a woman to refuse the wall long enough and steadily enough that the wall simply became unnecessary. On a night in late October, the clinic quiet, and the city doing the particular beautiful thing it did. When autumn hit properly, gold and cool, and smelling of the world turning, Celeste sat on the examination table and looked at him where he stood by the window, and she said, "Are you happy?" He turned from the window and looked at her. The map was on the wall behind her. The lights were warm. She was wearing scrubs and had a pen tucked behind her ear, and she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen in 340 years, which was a considerable span of time that included genuine marvels. "I am," he said, and the simplicity of it was the most complex thing he had ever said. No qualification, no armor, no deliberate arrangement of distance, she smiled. Warm and real and entirely, unreservedly hers. "Good," she said. "Me too." He came and sat beside her on the examination table, which he had done dozens of times by now, but which still carried, each time, the particular quality of choosing to be close, of choosing not to maintain the distance that had been his first language for so long. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary and extraordinary evening. Humans who did not know what moved beneath their streets, courts that had existed for centuries and would exist for centuries more. A boundary line held firm by an ancient vampire who was, for the first time in 340 years, fighting for something other than stability and protocol and the management of a world that had stopped surprising him. He was fighting, now, for this, for the warm human woman who had told him to sit down and meant it. For the clinic she had built with her own stubbornness and her own love. For the life they were building in the space between 2 worlds, stitched together with trust and care, and the willingness to refuse the walls that history said ought to stand. The map was on the wall. The city was outside the window, and Tavian Von Carstein, who had spent centuries learning to feel nothing, who had built an architecture of absence so thorough and so practiced that he had nearly forgotten what lived beneath it, held Celeste Winterbourne close in the quiet of her clinic, and felt, without armor, without distance, without any of the careful management of 300 years, absolutely everything. And it was not as he had once believed it would be, too much to survive. It was, in fact, the first thing in 3 centuries that felt like being alive. He pressed his lips to her hair, and she turned her face up to his, and they stayed like that for a long time, while the city went about its business outside, unhurried and complete, 2 people in a warm room who had found, through danger and blood law and ancient pride, and one very stubborn woman who refused every wall he built. The most extraordinary thing either of them had ever managed each other. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.